Welcome to this video on complex argument forms. We have seen simple argument forms. Complex argument forms combine simple arguments to form more powerful arguments. The first one we will look at is biconditional construction. We have discussed biconditionals at length. Sometimes propositions are sufficient for each other. Consequently, they are also necessary for each other. We've seen that this is expressed as conditionals. When we have conditionals such that the antecedent of the first is the consequent of the second, and the consequent of the first is the antecedent of the second, then using conjunction introduction we are able to infer their conjunction. From this conjunction, we are able to infer the biconditional. For a memory mansion image of biconditional construction, I use the double arrow with a construction warning sign. Here is the form of biconditional construction. First, we have a conditional if P then Q. Second, we have another conditional using the same component propositions but in reverse positions, if Q then P. Next, we infer their conjunction. Finally, from their conjunction, we infer the biconditional. Biconditional construction works the same way with biconditionals that express contradiction. First, we have our conditional with the negated consequent, if P then not Q. Second, we have our conditional reversed, if not Q then P. Third, we form the conjunction of the conditionals. Finally, we infer the biconditional. The next argument form uses disjunctions and conditionals. It is called dilemma. Here's the idea. We start with a disjunction. Sometimes disjuncts are sufficient for further propositions. If so, we infer a disjunction of the consequence of those disjuncts. For a memory mansion image of dilemma, I think of a lemon. I also imagine someone who hates lemons throwing a knife into the lemon screaming, "Die, lemon!" Die, lemon for dilemma. Here's the form for dilemma. First, we start with our disjunction. Next, we have a conditional stating that P is sufficient for R. Okay, that's one disjunct. Let's look at the other. Here's a conditional for if Q then S. At this point, we have introduced a new letter. I think of a snake hissing for S. Hiss for S. Now then, each of our disjuncts is sufficient for some other proposition. So we infer disjunction of the consequence of those disjuncts. From the disjunction either P or Q, and the fact that P implies R and Q implies S, we infer the disjunction either R or S. Here's dilemma in action. Suppose you know that Fred got a pet, and knowing Fred, you know that he either got a dog or a cat. From this, you know that either Fred got a pet that barks or a pet that meows. There is a way to eliminate disjunctions. That is, there is a way of inferring a single proposition from a pair of disjuncts. This happens when the disjuncts imply the same proposition. For a memory mansion image of disjunction elimination, I think of a pile of this junk or disjunct. Disjunction. I want to eliminate it, so I burn it. Disjunct elimination for disjunction elimination. Here's the form for disjunction elimination. First, we start with our disjunction. Next, we have a conditional showing that P is sufficient for R. Third, we have a conditional showing that Q is sufficient for R. Since P and Q are both sufficient for R and at least one of P and Q is true, we know that R is true, so we infer R. Here's disjunctive elimination in action with Fred again. Since we know that either Fred got a dog or a cat, we know that both dogs and cats are mammals, we can infer that Fred's pet is a mammal. A few videos back, we were translating complex truth relations into propositions. We covered equivalent and contradictory. Do you remember that I said absolute and impossible could only be handled by complex argument forms? Well, here we go. Dilemma handles absolute truth relations. Recall that a proposition is absolutely true when it is necessary for a subcontrary. So our first step is to state that P is subcontrary to Q. We use a disjunction for that. Our second step is to state that P is necessary for Q. We use a conditional for that, if not P, then not Q. Our third step is to infer if Q, then P. We infer this from the previous conditional. Recall that if one proposition is sufficient for another, then the second is necessary for the first, and vice versa. Well, if P is necessary for Q, then Q is sufficient for P. Our last step is to infer P. Either P or Q is true, and Q is sufficient for P. So either way, P is true. It's absolutely true. Our next argument form is very effective. The phrase reductio ad absurdum literally means reduction to the absurd. The idea is to assume something for the sake of argument. From that assumption, we derive a contradiction. Contradictions cannot be true. So, since the proposition is sufficient for what cannot be true, the assumed proposition cannot be true. For a memory mansion image of reductio, I often think of Homer Simpson, who is absurd. Here is the form of reductio ad absurdum. First, we assume the proposition. Next, we have a conditional such that P is sufficient for Q. Following that, we have a conditional such that P is sufficient for the denial of Q. So we infer both Q and not Q. So using conjunction introduction, we have the contradiction Q and not Q. Since P implies a contradiction, we infer that P is not true. Here is reductio in action. Let us start with the idea that morality is culturally relative. That is, whatever is moral is determined by one's culture. If morality is culturally relative, then what other cultures determine to be moral is moral. So we should be tolerant of other cultures even if their moral code is different from ours. However, there's a snag. Some cultures are not tolerant. So since some cultures are not tolerant, we need not be tolerant in that culture. That is, some cultures demand intolerance. Ours is one of them, by the way. There are some practices, such as polygamy, that we do not tolerate. So as a consequence, we should be tolerant of other cultures since every culture's moral code is right, and we should be intolerant of other cultures since our culture demands it. So we infer that cultural relativism is false. Now, a note of caution here. This does not mean that we should abandon tolerance. No, we should be tolerant. However, we should be tolerant is better supported by the idea that morality is objective, not relative. If everyone should be tolerant, then likely that is because what is moral for everyone, and that is moral objectivism. A variation of the reductio is when the proposition is sufficient for its own denial. So since the proposition makes itself false, we infer that the proposition is false, hence it's self-defeating. For a memory mentioned image of self-defeating arguments, I imagine a guy punching in his own face. He is defeating himself. Here is the form of a self-defeating argument. First, we start with the assumption that a proposition is true. Second, we assert the conditional that it is contrary to itself, that is sufficient for its own denial. Using modus ponens, we infer not P. Using conjunction introduction, we infer the contradiction P and not P. Since P implies a contradiction, we infer that it is false. Here's an example of a self-defeating argument. Let us assume that everything is false. Well, if everything is false, so is the proposition that everything is false. So we infer that it is false that everything is false. Next, we have the conjunction that everything is false and it is false that everything is false. Finally, we infer that it is false that everything is false. That is, at least something is true. We have seen absolute propositions expressed using complex argument forms. Now we will look at impossible propositions. Recall that impossible propositions are propositions that are sufficient for their own contrary. So first, we state that P is sufficient for Q. Next, we state that Q is contrary to P. This is different from the usual disjunction we use, but the idea behind contrary propositions is that if one is true, then the other is false. So if Q is true, then P is false, or if Q, then not P. By hypothetical syllogism, we infer that P is sufficient for its own denial. Next, for the sake of argument, we assume P. Next, we infer the denial using the new conditional. We infer the conjunction showing the contradiction P and not P. So we infer that P is false. P is impossible, since it implies its own contrary. It cannot be true. Here's an example of an impossible proposition. All truth is relative. The statement all truth is relative is itself an absolute statement. So if all truth is relative, then there is at least one absolute truth, namely itself. However, if there is absolute truth, then it is false that all truth is relative. So by hypothetical syllogism, all truth is relative implies its own denial. We assume all truth is relative for the sake of argument. We infer its denial. We infer the contradiction. So by reductio, we infer that it's false, that all truth is relative. A variant of this is the self-referential incoherence. This is tricky. We don't exactly get to infer the denial of the assumed proposition, since the denial infers the original proposition. For a memory mentioned image of this, I use a merry-go-round. The reason is that from the original proposition we infer the denial, and from the denial we infer the original, and from the original we infer the denial, and on and so on and so on and so on. You might even think of it as a feedback loop. Here's the form. We start with the proposition. We have the conditional stating that the proposition is sufficient for its own denial. However, we also have that the denial is sufficient for the original proposition. So we infer the denial. But the denial is sufficient for the original, and on and on and on. Let's look at an example. Let us assume that this sentence is false. Well, either the sentence is true or the sentence is false. By its own description, it can't be true, so it's false. Now, since it says it's false, and it is false, it's true. So, if the sentence is false, then the sentence is true. Well, since it's true and it describes itself as false, then the sentence is false. So we can infer that the sentence is false. But we also infer that the sentence is true. And it is false, and it is true, and on and on and on. While we may not necessarily be able to claim that such sentences are either true or false, we can at least claim that we can't use them. They are incoherent. The next variant of reductio deals with justifying principles. By justifying principle, I mean a claim about what kinds of propositions can be proven or not proven. Self-referential insubstantiation is a justifying principle that either cannot justify itself or claims that it is unjustified. One common instance of this is you can't prove a negative. Well, structurally, the claim is itself a negative, so it claims it cannot be proven. One wonders then why one should listen to it. Also, there are lots of ways to prove negatives, modus tollens for one. Here are the terms for this video. Be able to identify, construct, and use the argument forms off the top of your head. This will help you master philosophy and reason in general. That wraps it up for argument forms. The next few videos deal with some equivalent propositions and denials of propositions. They come in handy in argumentation.